At 0430 hours, on April 29, 1944, Nancy Wake stood in a forest clearing 12 kilometers south of Montluçon in central France, watching her radio operator Denis Rake burn the last of his code books. Rake had been transmitting to London when a German direction-finding team located his position. He had 90 seconds to destroy all codes, dismantle the radio, and evacuate before Wehrmacht troops surrounded the farmhouse he'd been using as a transmission site. He destroyed the codes. He escaped with the radio components. But without the codes, the radio was useless. Wake commanded 7,000 Maquis fighters spread across the Auvergne region, armed groups of French resistance fighters preparing to support the Allied invasion everyone knew was coming. These fighters needed weapons, ammunition, explosives, and money. All of it came from London via parachute drops coordinated by radio. Without radio contact, there would be no drops. Without drops, 7,000 fighters would be useless when the invasion began. Wake had one option. Someone had to reach another Special Operations Executive network, obtain their codes, and return to restore communications. The nearest SOE network with compatible radio equipment was in Châteauroux, 200 kilometers northeast. The journey would require crossing German checkpoints, passing through towns with Wehrmacht garrisons, and traveling roads patrolled by the Gestapo, who had been hunting Wake for 3 years. The Gestapo called her the White Mouse. They had a price of 5 million francs on her head, the highest bounty placed on any Allied agent in France. They knew her real name was Nancy Wake. They knew she was British Special Operations Executive. They knew she had organized escape lines that smuggled over 1,000 Allied airmen out of France. They knew she was responsible for dozens of successful sabotage operations. They had a file on her in Paris that was 200 pages long. What they didn't know was what she looked like now, or where she was, or that she was about to bicycle 500 kilometers through occupied France to get radio codes. Wake made her decision in less than 5 minutes. She would go herself. She was the only person in her network who spoke fluent French without an accent, who could forge identity documents convincingly, who had the training to handle interrogation if caught, and who had the physical endurance to make the journey. She gave orders to her deputy to maintain operations during her absence. She obtained a bicycle from a local farmer. She dressed in clothing that made her look like a rural Frenchwoman traveling between villages to visit family. She carried forged papers identifying her as Lucienne Carlier, a widow from Marseille. At 06:15 hours on April 29th, Wake departed the forest camp, heading northeast toward Châteauroux. The distance was 200 kilometers, approximately 125 miles. She estimated the journey would take 18 hours of continuous cycling. She would arrive after midnight, obtain the code, sleep for a few hours, then cycle 200 kilometers back, arriving within 48 hours. The plan was optimistic. The actual journey would take 72 hours and cover over 500 kilometers after detours, wrong turns, and evasion routes. Nancy Grace Augusta Wake was born on August 30, 1912 in Wellington, New Zealand. She was the youngest of 6 children. Her father was a journalist. Her mother was domineering and cold. The family moved to Sydney, Australia in 1914 when Wake was 2 years old. Her father abandoned the family when she was 20. Wake ran away from home at 16 with $200 she'd inherited from an aunt. She moved to London, trained as a nurse, then worked as a freelance journalist in Paris in the 1930s. In 1933, while working in Vienna, she witnessed a Nazi rally where brown shirts beat elderly Jewish men in the street. Wake watched stormtroopers force old men to scrub pavements with toothbrushes while crowds jeered. The sight enraged her. She later said that moment convinced her to fight fascism by any means necessary. In 1939, she was living in Marseille, married to French industrialist Henri Fiocca. When war broke out, Wake joined the French ambulance service and worked as a nurse. After France fell in June 1940, Wake began working with the escape line organization that would become the Pat O'Leary Line, smuggling Allied airmen and escaped prisoners of war from France to Spain. Between 1940 and 1943, Wake helped over 1,000 Allied servicemen escape. She concealed them in safe houses, provided forged documents, guided them through Vichy France to the Spanish border. The work was dangerous. Discovery meant immediate arrest, torture, and execution. The Gestapo began investigating the escape line in 1942. They knew someone codenamed the White Mouse was running operations in Marseille. They didn't know who. Wake's husband Henri used his money and connections to protect her, bribing officials, creating false trails, providing alibis. But by late 1943, the Gestapo was closing in. Wake fled to Spain in November 1943, crossing the Pyrenees on foot. Henri stayed behind. He was arrested by the Gestapo in 1943, tortured for information about his wife, and executed in October 1943. Wake didn't learn of his death until after the war ended. In Spain, Wake contacted British intelligence. She was extracted to Britain in January 1944. She immediately volunteered for Special Operations Executive. SU trained agents for insertion into occupied Europe to conduct sabotage, organize resistance networks, and coordinate uprisings to support the Allied invasion. Wake's experience in France, her fluent French, her proven ability to operate under pressure made her an ideal candidate. SOE put her through the full training program. Unarmed combat weapons handling explosives, radio operation, parachute training, interrogation, resistance. She excelled at all of it. Her instructors noted she was fearless, physically tough, and had an unusual talent for thinking tactically under stress. On April 29, 1944, Wake parachuted into the Auvergne region of central France as part of a 3-person SOE team codenamed Freelance. Her mission was to organize and arm Maquis groups to conduct sabotage operations against German forces when the invasion began. The team consisted of Wake radio operator Dennis Rake and team leader John Farmer. Within weeks, Wake had organized 7,000 Maquis fighters into an effective guerrilla force. They conducted ambushes, destroyed bridges, cut telephone lines, and attacked German convoys. Wake personally led several operations, including an attack on a Gestapo headquarters in Montluçon that killed 38 Germans. Now, less than 4 months after arriving, she was cycling through occupied France to get radio codes because her operator had been compromised. The first checkpoint appeared at 0730 hours, a Wehrmacht roadblock on the D916 highway north of Montluçon. 2 soldiers, a wooden barrier across the road, a machine gun position behind sandbags. Wake slowed her bicycle and stopped at the barrier. A Wehrmacht private approached, requested her papers. Wake handed him her forged identity card and travel permit. The documents identified her as Lucienne Carlier, traveling from Montluçon to Châteauroux to visit her sister, whose husband had been killed in a factory accident. The private examined the papers. Wake stood with her bicycle, breathing normally, showing appropriate nervousness for a civilian at a military checkpoint, but not the terror of someone with something to hide. The private asked why she was traveling by bicycle. Wake explained that train service was unreliable, and she could not afford black market gasoline for a car. The private asked if she had food in her bag. Wake opened the bag, showing bread and cheese. The private looked, found nothing suspicious, returned her papers, and waved her through. The interaction lasted 90 seconds. Wake cycled past the checkpoint and continued northeast. The encounter was routine, exactly as she'd trained for. Checkpoints were everywhere in occupied France. Germans stopped travelers, constantly checking papers, searching for contraband, looking for suspicious behavior. Most checkpoint guards were bored conscripts performing routine security duties. They checked papers mechanically, asked standard questions, and waved people through unless they saw something obviously wrong. Wake's forged documents were excellent. SOE's forgery section in London had created papers indistinguishable from genuine documents. The photograph on Wake's identity card matched her current appearance. The travel permit had appropriate stamps and signatures. The cover story was believable and consistent. She would pass dozens of checkpoints over the next 3 days. Most would be routine. Some would be dangerous. By 0900 hours, Wake had covered 40 kilometers. The road followed the Cher River Valley northeast through rolling farmland. Villages appeared every 10 to 15 kilometers, small agricultural communities occupied by German garrison troops. Wake passed through 3 villages without stopping, cycling at a steady pace that didn't attract attention. Too slow suggested she was stalling or watching for someone. Too fast suggested she was fleeing or carrying urgent messages. Wake maintained 15 kilometers per hour, the pace of a woman cycling a long distance without particular urgency. The bicycle was a 1938 Peugeot with a single speed and no gears. The roads were rough cobblestones in towns and packed dirt between villages. The weather was clear, temperature approximately 15 degrees Celsius, light wind from the west. Wake wore a plain brown dress, wool cardigan, and cloth cap. The clothing was worn but clean, appropriate for a working-class woman traveling in rural France. She carried a canvas bag containing bread, cheese, a water bottle, and hidden beneath the food, a concealed pocket holding 50,000 francs in cash, and a small Beretta pistol with one magazine. At 11:30 hours, Wake reached Saint-Amand-Montrond, a town 80 kilometers northeast of Montluçon. The town had a Wehrmacht garrison of approximately 200 soldiers. The main road through town passed directly in front of the German headquarters. Wake cycled through without stopping and making eye contact with no one, showing no interest in German positions or activities. Two Wehrmacht soldiers standing outside a cafe watched her pass. Neither moved to stop her. By 1300 hours, Wake had covered 100 kilometers in 7 hours. Her legs ached. Her hands were numb from gripping the handlebars. Her back hurt from the cycling position. She stopped in a village called Château-Meillant, purchased more bread from a bakery, filled her water bottle from a public fountain, and sat on a bench for 15 minutes. The break was necessary to avoid physical collapse, but dangerous because it gave locals time to notice her. In occupied France, strangers were always suspicious. Villages were small enough that everyone knew everyone. A woman cycling alone through German-occupied territory was unusual enough to merit attention. Wake ate her bread slowly, watching the street. No one approached. After 15 minutes, she resumed cycling. The road climbed into hills north of Château-Meillant. Wake's legs burned. The bicycle had no gears. Climbing required standing on the pedals and forcing them down with her full body weight. Her thighs cramped. She ignored the pain and kept pedaling. At 15:30 hours, she reached Lignières, 130 kilometers from her starting point, another checkpoint. This one was different. A Gestapo checkpoint, not Wehrmacht. Two men in civilian clothes, a black Citroën parked across the road, a third man sitting in the car with a radio. Gestapo checkpoints were far more dangerous than Wehrmacht checkpoints. Wehrmacht soldiers checked papers mechanically and waved people through, unless they found obvious contraband. Gestapo agents interrogated travelers, looking for inconsistencies in stories, checking details against records, searching for resistance members. Wake stopped at the barrier. One agent approached, requested papers. Wake handed him her identity card and travel permit. The agent examined them carefully, longer than the Wehrmacht private that morning. He asked her name. She replied, Lucienne Carlier. He asked where she was traveling from. Montluçon. Where was she going? Châteauroux. Why? To visit her sister. What was her sister's name? Marie Dubois. What was the address? 14, Rue de la République. How long would she stay? 3 days. What did her sister's husband do? He was dead, killed in a factory accident. The agent asked these questions rapidly, watching Wake's face for hesitation or inconsistency. Wake answered without pausing, maintaining eye contact, showing no nervousness beyond what a civilian would naturally feel when questioned by Gestapo. The agent asked to see inside her bag. Wake opened it. He removed the bread and cheese, examined them, found the money concealed beneath the food. He pulled out the cash, counted it. 50,000 francs. Where did she get this money? Wake had prepared for this question. She explained that her late husband had left her a small inheritance and she was carrying cash to help her sister, whose husband's death had left her without income. The agent asked why she wasn't carrying the money in a bank account or postal order. Wake explained that banks required identification documents and her sister's papers had been lost in a fire. Cash was simpler. The agent stared at her for 30 seconds. Wake maintained eye contact, breathing normally. Her heart rate was elevated but controlled. If the agent searched more carefully, he would find the pistol. If he ordered her to the Gestapo office for more detailed interrogation, her cover would eventually break. Forged documents could pass casual inspection, but not detailed investigation with records checks. The agent returned the money to her bag, handed back her papers, and waved her through. The interaction lasted 5 minutes. Wake cycled past the checkpoint, maintaining steady speed until she was out of sight around a curve. Then she stopped, leaned the bicycle against a tree, and vomited from stress and exhaustion. She rested for 3 minutes, drank water, and continued. By 1800 hours, Wake had covered 160 kilometers. She was still 40 kilometers from Châteauroux. Her legs no longer hurt because they were numb. Her hands had blisters from gripping the handlebars. Her lower back spasmed every time she shifted position. She had been cycling for 12 hours with one 15-minute break. The sun set at 20-30 hours. Wake continued in darkness. The roads had no lighting. She navigated by moonlight and memory of the route she'd studied on maps before departing. Villages appeared as dark clusters of buildings. Occasionally, German vehicles passed their blackout headlights, providing minimal illumination. Wake pulled to the side of the road and stopped when she heard engines standing with her bicycle until the vehicles passed. Cycling on dark roads with German military traffic was suicidal. Better to lose time than be hit by a truck. At 22:45 hours, Wake reached the outskirts of Châteauroux. The town was under curfew. Civilians on the streets after 2200 hours were subject to arrest. Wake hid her bicycle in bushes and approached the town on foot, staying in shadows. The SOE network she needed to contact operated from a safe house in the town center. Wake had memorized the address but had never been there. She navigated through back streets, avoiding main roads where German patrols operated. At 23:15 hours, she found the address, a 3-story building on a narrow street. She approached the door, knocked 3 times, paused, knocked twice. The recognition signal. No answer. She waited 60 seconds and repeated the knock pattern. The door opened slightly. A man's voice asked who was there. Wake gave her code name, Hélène. The door opened. She entered. The man closed and locked the door behind her. He was the network's courier. He recognized Wake's code name and brought her to the network commander, a British SOE officer named Richard Escpaped. Escpaped was surprised to see Wake. He knew of her operation in the Auvergne, but had no idea she was in Châteauroux. Wake explained the situation. Her radio operator had lost his codes. She needed compatible codes to restore communications with London. Escpaped confirmed his network used the same radio equipment and could provide codes. But he had a problem. His radio operator was not present. He was conducting a transmission from a rural location 20 kilometers outside town. He would return the next morning. Wake would have to wait. Escpaped offered Wake food and a place to sleep. She ate stale bread and drank ersatz coffee made from chicory. She slept for 4 hours on a couch in the safe house, fully clothed, her pistol within reach. At 06:30 hours on April 30th, she woke. Escpaped's radio operator arrived at 0800 hours with the codes. He spent 30 minutes writing them out by hand, double-checking every number. Radio codes were complex substitution ciphers using 5-digit number groups. A single error would make the codes unusable. At 0900 hours, Wake had the codes written on 2 sheets of paper, folded and concealed in her dress. She thanked Escpaped, retrieved her bicycle, and departed Châteauroux, heading southwest. She had to return 200 kilometers to her network. The return journey would be more dangerous. German patrols would be active during daylight. The Gestapo would be searching for resistance members after recent sabotage operations. And Wake was exhausted. She had cycled 200 kilometers in 18 hours, slept for 4 hours, and now faced another 200 kilometers. At 10:30 hours, she passed through a Wehrmacht checkpoint north of Châteauroux. The soldiers checked her papers and waved her through. At 1200 hours, she stopped in Issoudun to buy food. The town had a large German garrison. Wake purchased bread from a bakery, deliberately chose a shop with German soldiers inside to demonstrate she had nothing to hide. She made small talk with the baker about the weather, while 2 Wehrmacht officers stood behind her waiting to be served. She paid left and continued cycling. By 1400 hours, she had covered 60 kilometers from Châteauroux. Her legs were seizing. Every revolution of the pedals required conscious effort to push through the pain. She stopped every 10 kilometers to rest briefly, knowing that longer stops would result in her muscles completely locking up. At 1600 hours, she reached a Gestapo checkpoint near Le Châtre. This checkpoint was more thorough than the previous days. 3 Gestapo agents and a Wehrmacht squad. They were searching every traveler, checking identity documents against a list. Wake stopped at the barrier. An agent approached, demanded papers. She provided them. The agent compared her identity card photograph to her face, then checked her name against a typewritten list on a clipboard. Wake's real name, Nancy Wake, was certainly on that list. Her cover name, Lucienne Carlier, was probably not. But if the Gestapo had identified her cover identity through interrogation of captured resistance members, she would be arrested immediately. The agent checked the list, found no match, and asked her standard questions. Where was she traveling from? Châteauroux. Where was she going? Montluçon. Why? Returning home after visiting her sister. The agent asked if she was carrying anything other than food. Wake said no. The agent ordered her to open her bag. Wake opened it. The agent searched, found bread and cheese and the concealed money. He counted it. 48,000 francs, slightly less than yesterday, because Wake had spent money on food. The agent asked why she was carrying so much cash. Wake repeated her cover story about helping her sister. The agent accepted the explanation, returned her papers and waved her through. Wake cycled past the checkpoint. She was 100 kilometers from her network's base. By 1900 hours, exhaustion was overwhelming. Wake had been cycling for 10 hours, covering 140 kilometers. Combined with yesterday's 200 kilometers, she had cycled 340 kilometers in 34 hours, with only 4 hours of sleep. Her vision was blurring. Her hands were bleeding from burst blisters. Her legs moved mechanically, no longer responding to conscious control, just repeating the motion of pushing pedals. She stopped in a village called Evaux-les-Bains. She found a barn outside town, hid inside, and slept for 3 hours. At 2200 hours, she woke disoriented and in pain. Every muscle in her body hurt. Her inner thighs were raw from friction against the bicycle seat. Her shoulders and neck were locked in spasm. She forced herself to stand, walked in circles until her legs began responding, then retrieved her bicycle and continued. She cycled through the night. German convoys passed occasionally. Wake hid. When she heard engines, waited until the vehicles passed, then continued. Navigation was difficult in darkness. She missed a turn and cycled 15 kilometers in the wrong direction before realizing her error. She backtracked, losing an hour. At 400 hours on May 1st, she reached the outskirts of Montluçon. She hid the bicycle and approached her network's base on foot. German patrols were searching the area after recent resistance activity. Wake observed patrol patterns for 30 minutes, identified a gap in coverage, and moved through it. At 0500 hours, she reached the forest camp where her network was based. Sentries challenged her. She gave the recognition signal. They brought her to her deputy. Wake handed him the radio codes, reported the situation in Châteauroux, and collapsed. She had cycled over 500 kilometers in 72 hours through occupied France, passing dozens of German checkpoints, evading Gestapo patrols, and delivering the codes that would restore communications with London. She slept for 18 hours. Dennis Rake encoded a message using the new codes and transmitted to London on May 2nd. London acknowledged receipt. Communications were restored. Within a week, parachute drops resumed. Wake's Maquis force received 25 tons of weapons, ammunition, and explosives. The force conducted over 100 successful operations against German targets in the weeks leading up to D-Day. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, Wake's network cut German telephone lines throughout the Auvergne, destroyed railroad tracks, ambushed Wehrmacht convoys, and prevented German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches. The Gestapo never caught the White Mouse. Despite 3 years of hunting her, despite the 5 million franc bounty, despite files and wanted posters and informants, they never identified her. They knew she existed. They knew she was responsible for massive damage to German operations in southern France. They knew hundreds of Allied airmen had escaped because of her organization. But they never caught her. Wake's 500-kilometer bicycle ride became legendary within SOE. After the war, she was awarded the George Medal by Britain, the Medal of Freedom by the United States, the Médaille de la Résistance and Croix de Guerre by France, and the Medal of the Resistance by New Zealand. She was the most decorated servicewoman of World War II. The physical toll of the bicycle ride was severe. Wake suffered permanent nerve damage in her hands from gripping the handlebars for 72 hours. She had chronic back problems for the rest of her life. Her knees were damaged from the repetitive stress of cycling 500 kilometers with no gears. But she never complained about it. When asked about the ride years later, she said it was uncomfortable but necessary. Someone had to get the codes. She was the only person who could make the journey. So she went. The psychological toll was harder to measure. Wake cycled through occupied France, knowing that capture meant torture and execution. She passed through dozens of checkpoints, knowing that any Gestapo agent could identify her. She carried documents she knew would not withstand detailed scrutiny. She maintained her cover while exhausted in pain and terrified. The stress of maintaining perfect composure for 72 hours, while death was one mistake away, would have broken most people. Wake simply did what was necessary. Her ability to function under that level of stress came from her training and her personality. SE training emphasized functioning under pressure, making decisions despite fear and compartmentalizing emotions during operations. Wake had all of those capabilities naturally. She was not fearless. She understood the risks. She simply refused to let fear stop her from doing what needed to be done. After the war, Wake returned to Britain. Her husband Henry was dead executed by the Gestapo in 1943. She never remarried. She worked for British intelligence briefly, then left government service. She moved to Australia in 1960, lived quietly in Sydney, gave occasional interviews about her wartime service, and maintained contact with other SOE veterans. In 1985, she was interviewed for a television documentary about SOE operations in France. The interviewer asked her how she felt about killing Germans during the war. Wake's response was characteristic. She said she had killed a German sentry with her bare hands during a raid on a Gestapo headquarters because he saw her and would have raised the alarm if she didn't kill him immediately. She said she felt nothing about it. He was the enemy. He would have killed her if given the chance. She killed him first. That was war. The interviewer asked if she had nightmares about the war. Wake said no. She said she slept perfectly well. She'd done her job. She'd saved lives. She'd hurt the enemy. She had no regrets. Nancy Wake died on August 7, 2011 in London at the age of 98. She had outlived nearly everyone who knew about her wartime service. Her ashes were scattered in the hills of Montluçon, where she had commanded her Maquis network. The French government sent a representative to the ceremony. The British government sent a representative. Her obituary in the Times called her the most decorated woman of World War II and one of the most effective resistance organizers in France. The lesson of Nancy Wake's 500-kilometer bicycle ride is that sometimes there are no good options. Her radio operator lost the codes through no fault of his own. German direction-finding teams were effective and ruthless. Once the codes were lost, someone had to get new ones. Wake had no support, no backup plan, no alternative. She could either cycle 500 kilometers through occupied France or abandon 7,000 fighters who were depending on her network for weapons and coordination. She chose to go. She cycled for 72 hours through checkpoints and patrols in pain. She got the codes. She restored communications. She completed her mission. That was the job. The physical cost was permanent damage to her hands, back, and knees. The psychological cost was 72 hours of sustained terror. The alternative was failure, and failure was unacceptable. Wake never sought recognition for the ride. She never wrote a book or gave detailed interviews or promoted herself. When people called her a hero, she dismissed it. She said she'd done what needed to be done, what anyone in her position would have done. That was characteristic modesty. Most people in her position would not have cycled 500 kilometers through occupied France. Most people would have found reasons why the mission was impossible. Most people would have failed. Nancy Wake succeeded because she was not most people. She was the white mouse, the woman the Gestapo could never catch, the woman who bicycled through their checkpoints carrying their wanted posters with her name on them. She was the most dangerous woman in France, and she killed the enemy, saved Allied lives, and won her war one bicycle ride at a time.